In 1919, Canada stitched itself together with steel, a nationalized railway stretching coast to coast, a lifeline for 1,000 towns with no other link to the outside world. By 1968, over 6,000 miles of that track had been torn from the earth. Nearly 1,000 stations sealed shut. Entire communities severed and left to wither. This was not inevitable decline. One man, a banker who had never run a railroad, was handed the keys to Canada's largest public network, and the cold arithmetic he brought with him would scar the nation for generations. Steel rails once stitched Canada together, binding distant coasts and scattered towns into a single country. In 1919, at the end of a bruising decade of war and recession, the government merged bankrupt private lines into a single public giant, Canadian National Railways. Parliament's act was not just a rescue, it was a declaration. The new railway would be a lifeline, a promise that no community, however remote, would be left behind. Posters from the era boasted of a nation bound by steel, and the company's own charter spoke of serving the needs of the people from sea to sea. The scale was staggering. Over 20,000 miles of main line and branch track reached into every province, from the fog-bound harbors of Newfoundland to the wheat towns of Saskatchewan and the sawmills of British Columbia's interior. CN's slogan, "The People's Railway," was more than advertising. For thousands of rural communities, the arrival of the daily mixed train was a ritual. Mailbags thumped onto wooden platforms, crates of livestock and barrels of apples loaded and shipped. Families reunited or parted at the station doors. The railway was the first link to the outside world and, for many, the only one that mattered. Government pamphlets called it Canada's backbone. School children learned to trace the red line of CN across classroom maps, watching it cross rivers and mountains, binding French and English, prairie and coast. The railway's annual reports, thick with tables and charts, nevertheless opened with stirring language about unity and progress. The 1920 annual message declared, "No region too distant, no town too small. The railway serves all." For decades, this promise held. Even as highways crept outward and trucks started to appear on rural roads, the railway remained the main artery of commerce and community. In the 1940s and the 1950s, steam gave way to diesel, but the spirit of nation-building endured. CN was not simply an enterprise to be judged by profit and loss. It was a public trust, underwritten by taxpayers and Parliament, and its sprawling network was defended as essential to the country's survival. By the late 1950s, however, the mood began to darken. The numbers in those annual reports grew grim. Losses topped $100 million a year. Private car ownership doubled in a single decade, and new highways drew traffic away from the rails. Yet in the collective memory, the railway's founding ideal lingered. The vision of a country bound together by steel, of a public network serving every corner, regardless of cost, remained a powerful symbol. That ideal would soon be tested as never before. Red ink spilled across the ledgers of Canadian National Railways as the 1950s drew to a close. Losses soared past $100 million a year, a figure that dwarfed the budgets of entire provinces. Each annual report carried the same grim refrain. Operating costs outpaced revenues, deficits deepened, and the network's sprawling reach now looked less like a public service and more like a financial sinkhole. The numbers told a story of a country in motion, but not by rail. In 1950, 4 million Canadians owned cars. By 1960, that number had doubled to 8 million. The family sedan, once a luxury, had become a staple. Asphalt replaced ballast as the symbol of modern mobility. The Trans-Canada Highway Act, passed in 1949, funneled over $200 million into a ribbon of pavement stretching from St. John's to Victoria. Every mile of new highway drew traffic away from the rails, and every new subdivision on the urban fringe seemed to sprout a driveway instead of a station platform. Government spending followed the trend. The federal budget of 1956 earmarked more for highway construction than for railway subsidies for the first time. Trucks now hauled freight that once rattled in boxcars. Rural bus routes began to shadow abandoned branch lines, promising to fill the gap, yet ridership numbers rarely justified the expense. In the prairies, grain elevators that once counted on daily trains watched as farmers turned to trucking, even as fuel costs crept upward. In the Maritimes, timber yards faced delays and higher rates as rail service faltered. The pressure was relentless. Parliamentarians debated whether the country could afford to underwrite a network built for a different era, while editorial pages called for modernization and efficiency. In closed-door meetings, Treasury officials tallied the mounting debt and warned that the railway's deficits threatened to swamp federal finances. The public rhetoric still spoke of the railway as a national lifeline, but internal memos painted a bleaker picture. Every lightly used branch, every remote station became a line item to be scrutinized, a potential saving to be found. By the end of the decade, the logic of the balance sheet began to overshadow the language of nation building. The ground had shifted. The old promise that no community would be left behind now clashed with a new, colder arithmetic. The search for a solution was no longer just about keeping trains running. It was about finding someone willing to make the hard choices, no matter the cost. Donald Gordon arrived at Canadian National Railways in 1961 with the bearing of a central banker and the mandate of a corporate surgeon. His appointment, sealed by Order in Council G61-112, drew instant controversy. The government handed him not just the presidency, but sweeping authority to restructure the entire network, an empire of tracks, stations, and payrolls that stretched beyond the reach of most prime ministers. Gordon's salary, $250,000 a year, was the highest ever granted to a public servant in Canada. It was more than double the pay of the Prime Minister himself, and it ignited a firestorm in Parliament. Hansard Records' John Diefenbaker's stinging rebuke. A banker is now to run a railway. For $250,000 a year, this is a scandal worthy of a royal commission. The press seized on the spectacle. Time magazine called him the banker at the switch points, while the Globe and Mail ran stories on the extraordinary pay, the private sector perks, and the new president's total lack of railway experience. Gordon, for his part, seemed unfazed by the uproar. He was a numbers man, shaped in the crucible of wartime price controls and post-war monetary policy. To him, Canadian National's sprawling network was not a tapestry of communities, but a balance sheet bleeding red ink. He told the Canadian Institute of Management, "If the railway cannot pay its own way, the taxpayer will pay the price, and the service will suffer." Gordon's philosophy was blunt. The railway existed to make money, not to serve geography. He dismissed what he called sentimental rural protests as nostalgia for a vanished world. In his view, every underused branch line, every empty rural station, was a financial liability dragging down the whole enterprise. He saw the network as a relic of an older Canada, built for an era when trains were the only way to cross vast distances. Now, as car ownership surged and highways multiplied, Gordon argued that the country could no longer afford to underwrite loss-making lines in the name of national unity. Inside the boardroom, Gordon set about importing the logic of the balance sheet. He commissioned a sweeping audit of the entire system, modeled on the British Beeching Report, with a single goal: identify every section of track, every station, every bridge that failed to turn a profit. The language of modernization, efficiency, rationalization, cost recovery became the new gospel. Gordon's critics called it cold arithmetic. His supporters called it realism. Either way, the era of the People's Railway was over. In its place stood a president who measured value in dollars, not in miles of track or names on a station sign. The blueprint for erasure was taking shape, and Donald Gordon held the pen. Donald Gordon's plan arrived not as a suggestion, but as a mandate, typed and stamped in the language of cold arithmetic. The internal memo dated July 7, 1962, drew its inspiration from Britain's Beeching Report, and its message was unmistakable. 6,000 miles of Canadian National Railways track and over 1,000 rural stations were to be erased from the map. The document did not linger on sentiment or history. Instead, it catalogued non-core lines and assigned each a value, almost always a negative one. On a single page, the lifelines of hundreds of towns became little more than red ink to be scrubbed from the ledger. The numbers fell like a hammer. 6,214 miles of track identified for abandonment, 1,017 stations marked for closure, and more than 200 bridges slated for demolition. The average price to wipe out a mile of track was set at $2,000, a figure that included not just rails and ties, but the removal of every last bridge and signal. Treasury Board tenders listed entire bridge removal packages, costed, scheduled, and awarded to demolition firms with instructions to leave nothing behind that could tempt future restoration. In the cabinet minutes from 1964, the rationale is spelled out in stark terms. Eliminate redundant infrastructure, realize immediate savings, and apply the surplus to national highway construction. The cost of this erasure was not just counted in dollars. The memo's appendices detailed the engineering logic, traffic density thresholds, cost per mile ratios, and projected savings, but the effect was blunt. In the prairies, the Weyburn to Wawanesa line was condemned for failing to meet the minimum daily train count. In the Maritimes, branch lines to Bathurst and Summerside were declared unsustainable, their stations reduced to entries in a cost recovery table. Across Quebec and northern Ontario, the list of condemned lines read like a census of forgotten places. The bridge tally alone was staggering. 200 structures, some more than 1,000 feet long, each assigned a demolition price and a deadline. The Treasury's records show a standard contract rate, $2,000 per mile, with bridge removals bundled into multi-million-dollar packages. Engineering reports warned that rebuilding even a fraction of these crossings would require tens of millions in new investment. Yet the orders pressed forward. The policy was to make restoration not just unlikely, but nearly impossible. The financial calculus reached its climax in the cabinet minutes of 1964. There, the government approved the reallocation of nearly $200 million in projected railway savings directly to the Trans-Canada Highway Fund. The logic was unyielding. Every mile of rail abandoned became another mile of four-lane pavement. The official record described the highway as a more flexible, cost-effective solution for a country whose population was now measured in cars, not train tickets. Gordon's directive power was absolute. He signed off on closures with the authority of a central banker, unmoved by the pleas of mayors or the protests of rural MPs. In his own words, "The railway must pay its own way, or it will be paid for by the taxpayer." The blueprint for erasure was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate, technocratic campaign, one that measured the value of connection in dollars and found most of the country wanting. Bathurst, New Brunswick, once thrived on rail. In 1961, the town counted nearly 13,000 people and saw over 1 million tons of freight move through its CN yard each year. By 1971, after the line was cut and the station shuttered, Bathurst's population had fallen by almost 7%. Rail freight collapsed by nearly half. The promised bus replacements ran sporadically, then vanished, leaving residents, especially the elderly, stranded. The story repeated across Prince Edward Island, where the end of rail in 1969 forced potato farmers onto highways, boosting shipping costs by 12% and slowing the province's growth to half the national average. In Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula, 15 small stations lost service in a single sweep. Timber firms, once dependent on daily boxcars, watched costs rise as they switched to trucks, and the region lost 3% of its working-age population in a decade. In Hearst, Northern Ontario, iron ore shipments fell by more than 40% after the rail link was severed. The town's population dropped by 8%. Even the construction of a new airport could not offset the sudden isolation. The prairies saw branch lines like Weyburn to Wawanesa abandoned, grain elevators forced to rely on trucks, and farmers paying higher rates, 85 cents a bushel instead of 70 cents. Smithers, in the forests of British Columbia, lost its passenger trains and a third of its lumber freight. Indigenous communities along the old lines reported longer journeys for basic goods and fewer opportunities to sell to distant markets. For each town, the loss was not just economic, but existential, a severing of the only thread tying them to the rest of Canada. On October 26, 1966, a quiet notice appeared in the back pages of Canadian newspapers. Canadian National would discontinue the Dominion, its flagship passenger service, at the end of the month. The announcement landed with the finality of a death notice. For nearly half a century, the Dominion had been the steel thread running from Montreal to Vancouver, carrying families, mail, and the hope of connection across 3,000 miles. Its schedule was printed in almanacs and posted in station windows from the Maritimes to the Rockies. Children learned to spell the names of distant towns by watching the Dominion's timetable. The last run was not marked by ceremony or fanfare. No dignitaries gathered on the platform. The train rolled west through autumn rain, past shuttered stations and silent grain elevators. The windows lit, but the cars half empty. On board, a few loyal passengers sat in the dome car, watching the landscape slip past, knowing they were witnessing the end of something larger than a timetable. At every stop, another chapter closed. Smithers, Melville, Sudbury, Gaspé, places that once counted on the Dominion's whistle to mark the rhythm of daily life. Canadian National's 1966 service notice framed the cancellation as necessary, a matter of modernization and efficiency, but the language could not soften the blow. The Dominion's disappearance was not just a business decision. It was the symbolic end of the promise that no community would be left behind. The loss echoed across the country, from island villages to prairie towns, as the last whistle faded and the rails fell silent. In that moment, a nation built on connection felt itself coming undone. Today, as Canada spends billions to revive fragments of lost rail, the price of Gordon's arithmetic grows steeper with every erased mile. Efficiency, once a slogan, now means rural isolation and empty ghost stations, reminders that what's destroyed for profit is rarely rebuilt for people. The rail lines are gone, but the cost of their absence only rises. What would it take to learn from that calculation? Share your thoughts below.